Welcome back. My name's Hugh Newman. Some of you know me, most of you probably, some of you don't. I organise the conference, I travel the world, I explore, and one of the things I've been getting really into over the last 6 to 8 months is looking at megalithic quarries. Now you might think that's a little bit strange, but actually it's a very important part of the whole megalithic culture from different parts of the world. And I believe that it's actually an ancient tradition where the birthplace of the temple is the quarry. So we're going to look at some examples in this lecture and about how I believe these stones were chosen because of their special powers, because of their location. So there's geodesy involved in the quarry location, and also where the site was then placed and built according to where the quarry was. Freemasons, Templars, and even traditions today still revere the quarry as the sacred place, as the birthplace of the temple, and rituals even today are still carried out there. But first, I just want to show some respect to the great John Michell. Many of you knew him. He was there at the very start of megalithomania. In fact, he allowed us to use the name megalithomania from his 1982 book. Which is an absolute classic. And this just small quote here, I'll let you read it yourself, just gives an inkling of what we're dealing with even today, even though this was written in 1969 from his great book, The View Over Atlantis. And he was aware of the birthplace of the temple. He was aware of the quarries, and he mentions that in some of his writings. So today we're just going to look at a few examples in the next 50 or 55 minutes. Obviously Stonehenge, the bluestone quarry in PRESELI, is a fascinating place in itself, but as Robin Heath has pointed out quite clearly, it's related to the placement of Stonehenge. So we're going to have a quick look at that. Also going to look at Aswan Quarry in Egypt, BAALBEK as well, and Solomon's quarries, which are very interesting. But we're then going to have a good look at the GOBEKLI TEPE and its sister site, KARAHAN TEPE, which is a very unknown site, but they revere and still have this ancient tradition, I believe. Then we have the lazy stones of OLLANTAYTAMBO in Peru, and the quarry up on the opposite mountain, and also on Easter Island, and a couple of examples from the OLMEC world in Mexico. And then I'm going to just have a brief outline of how important it is and how ritualized it has become. And how it's not only revered by the Freemasons and previously the Templars, but also by native societies today. So Stonehenge is the first example. Roughly 140 miles west of Stonehenge, we do have the PRESELI bluestone site. Here's just some nice shots of Stonehenge taken on one of our tours a couple of years ago. And it was around, even though it was built, they think now about 3250 BC, the bluestones were placed there at 2950 BC according to various people. There is evidence though of earlier bluestone activity with some of the shards found under the stones at Stonehenge. So this really fascinates me, suggesting that they were showing that the very earliest, the start phase, the beginning phase of Stonehenge was actually to do with PRESELI. The legend states that Merlin brought the stones from Ireland, which was written back in the 12 or 1300s. And this is the oldest known illustration of Stonehenge, showing Merlin with a giant. So I believe this is Merlin. A lot of people thought this was but I think this is Merlin instructing the giants to build Stonehenge. And they were said to have brought the stones over from Ireland, but potentially it's actually the bluestone site in Wales. The famous lunation triangle discovered by Robin Heath, his brother's here today obviously. If it's expanded 2,500 times over the landscape, we get this, linking the bluestone site with Lundy Island with Stonehenge. So does it suggest Stonehenge was placed according to where they quarried the stone from originally, the bluestone site? I suggest that might well be the case. Recent research has been done there by various archaeologists who say there's sacred springs there. It's actually still a sacred site, and this energy was then put into Stonehenge. So there's a lot of very interesting sort of theories and examples flying around about that. This just shows you the actual one of the bluestone sites itself. And you can see this beautiful rock. They're almost cut and ready to go by the looks of it. But this is actually how they form naturally. And there are examples of stoneworking actually still at the quarry, as though it's like a signature of these ancient people, leaving marks there so future generations can work out where the stones actually came from. This is a couple of examples of some of the Pythagorean triangles linking sites across the landscape, most notably here, obviously, with Stonehenge. And even Peter Knight came up with this brilliant Wessex asterism linking Stonehenge with a place called Brockley and Avebury and Glastonbury and other sites. But the line here actually goes to the bluestone site as well. It is actually this line here, just extending, and it even goes all the way around the world, which is something I get into more in my Earth Grids book. So it does show you the importance of the quarry site, the birthplace of the temple at Stonehenge, which is quite a good example. Aswan Quarry, now this is an absolutely fascinating place. A lot of the stone throughout Egypt was actually quarried from here. There's several different quarries in the Aswan area. This unfinished obelisk weighs 1,168 tons, which is one of the largest work stones on the planet. It's unfinished. It's still in situ. It's still partly attached to the bedrock. The biggest obelisk ever erected in Egypt was around 500 tons. This is over twice that weight. And you can see, when you go to Egypt, you look at some of these obelisks all over the country. It is utterly incredible and absolutely blew my mind when I first went there and actually witnessed some of these obelisks. But this one really fascinates me because it is an example of the biggest stone left in the quarry. I always think from my research, as you'll see today, it's as though they left the largest one in the quarry as well as it being the sacred birthplace of the temple. So I've got a very short video here I'm going to play about the quarry and about other sites that were built from that particular stone. The unfinished obelisk in Aswan weighs 1,168 tons, which is a remarkable feat in itself. What's also amazing is the fact that many of the stones, the casing stones of two of the pyramids on the Giza plateau, actually came from Aswan. Travelled all the way up the Nile, several hundred miles, and they cased two of the pyramids, not the Great Pyramid, the other two pyramids, with these particular stones. They're polygonal style, and they're just an incredible sight to behold. So we can see that there's red and black granite on this pyramid, not just red granite as I originally thought. So it's like a combination. I believe this was part of the original construction and not a later addition. It seems like it must have gone quite far up and it's just toppled down. Some cataclysmic event. There are many other sites all over Egypt that do come from Aswan Quarry. You can just see this huge block here, and you can just see the length of this. It's been precision carved. Whether it was done with these diorite balls, we're really not sure about, but there's a lot more granite across Egypt than just this. It looks like this quarry that they've just scooped out the rock really perfectly, just almost like it's ice cream or butter. And they've just removed it as though it's an extremely easy process for them. And they've left a mark here with some hieroglyphics on, which are fascinating. I wonder what that says and who could have done this. So these are the dolerite balls that are said to have chipped away and kind of created all these obelisks and other things here at Aswan Quarry, but it doesn't really make sense. I mean, maybe they, as Marcus Allen points out, they were used for rolling the stones on. No way that's just dolerite blocks doing that. That's some kind of machinery, it looks like.
Machinery, doesn't it? Anyway, Aswan Quarry is an amazing place. There's a lot more going on here than meets the eye because of so much stone that's been taken to all these various other places, often hundreds of miles away. There are geodetic connections between this site and the Giza pyramids, because there's a 365.4 mile length between them, which basically marks out the days of the year. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can check out a full analysis, an article I did on this on ancient-origins.net.
So you can see, this is a quick video I made about that. I just thought I'd show you that so it gives you some sort of first-hand shots of it. This is just the casing stone on the smaller pyramid, the smallest pyramid at the Giza Plateau, and you can just see the size of these. These are beautifully cut. These are transported 600 miles from Aswan Quarry, and these are exactly the same style you find in Peru and Bolivia, but also in Turkey and various other places around the world. And in fact, the earliest known directors of the Aswan Quarry was employed by Ramesses III, named Huri, about 1170 BC, although there's evidence, obviously, because of the construction of the pyramids, that it was used much, much earlier. But this is the earliest known date that the Aswan Quarry was in use. It was in use for at least 1,000 years, although technically probably 2,000 or 3,000. And even inside the Great Pyramid, we have the 70-ton granite lintels above the King's Chamber. These are also from Aswan Quarry. So it becomes quite a task when you actually think about it, some of the tonnage involved here. And it really does suggest there was a very high technology, or very sophisticated technique, at least, of how they would move it. To say it was just chipped away by these diorite spheres or balls is, I'm not too sure about that. If you look at some of the intricate carving technologies throughout Egypt, you can't really say it's actually that. And it would literally, I mean, some tests were done by Christopher Dunn, and Egyptologist Mark Lehner, and they said just to release the Aswan obelisk from the quarry would take 8 or 9 months of 24 hours a day chipping of about 50 people doing it, just to release it from the bedrock. And that's before you lift it out, carve it properly with all the beautiful hieroglyphics, and then try and transport it 600 miles. So there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. And also we find the same markings in various parts of the world. This is Aswan Quarry on the left here, and this is actually from the quarry Ollantaytambo in Peru, up on the opposite mountainside to Ollantaytambo, which is in the Sacred Valley on the way to Machu Picchu. And so we have exactly the same style markings that look like it's some kind of scooping technology, like ice cream even. And so there's obviously there's a lot more here than what we're being told. And on top of the great Aswan obelisk, the unfinished obelisk, are some markings of where they were cutting out another obelisk from the larger obelisk, which I find particularly interesting. But this is quite late, probably Roman or later. And it's almost like the obelisk itself was left in the quarry and was meant to be untouched. And it was meant to be left like that. There's just a theory I've been developing, and it actually marked a specific geodetic spot within the landscape, as we saw briefly in that video. But also, it's like a revered, imbued with power, sacred stone. And so you don't touch it, and you leave it as it is. And it's actually part of the greater system of temples across all of Egypt. So this is just a small discovery I made when I was researching this. It may have meaning, it may not, but between Aswan Quarry, the obelisk, and the Great Pyramids of Giza, it's exactly 365.4 nautical miles between them, which I thought was particularly interesting, obviously because it's the amount of days in a year, and does suggest that it may have been marking the lower boundary of Egypt, and it could have. Maybe they were going to erect it exactly or very close to where the quarry is, and various calculations were done with this, as you can see on the right there. I discuss more in detail in my Earth Grids book. But what's interesting as well is that Klaus Schmidt, who was the director of excavation until he unfortunately died last year, He stated in his book, in ancient Egypt, the dragging and erecting of holy pillars was an important part of ritual events, and he had some understanding of the actual construction and quarrying of the site was to do with a ritual technique. So let's have a look at Göbekli Tepe itself. Obviously, most of you, has anyone here not heard anything about Göbekli Tepe before? A few of you, okay. Göbekli Tepe is an incredible site. It's in southeast Turkey. It's 13 miles from Sanliurfa, or Urfa, it used to be called, which is also the birthplace of Abraham and ancient Edessa. And there's various circles of stone with these T-shaped pillars have been found all over the site. I've been there a few times, once with Graham Hancock and Andrew Collins. We do trips there. And it's basically 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, or 6,500 years older than the pyramids. So it's an incredibly ancient site. So when the pyramids were being built, when Stonehenge was being built, this was already ancient. This had been closed down, buried, and forgotten about for about 5,000 or 6,000 years before any of these other major sites were even being discovered. Klaus Schmidt, before he died, he mentioned in conversation with Andrew that he believes it could be up to 14,000 years old. So the dates are getting pushed back further and further with Göbekli Tepe. Here's just another example of some of the pillars, and you can see the beautiful carvings on them. You can't see them. You can see these kind of things all over them, and the sort of weird T-shaped pillars all in the circle, sort of facing inwards. Here's just some more examples. This is one of the enclosures, which has got some incredible carvings on. And so there are tool marks and cup marks on them as well. You can actually see them, not very well here, but on top of some of the stones, you do find cup marks like we find in Britain and various other parts of the world. Here's an example here, just inside one of the enclosures. They're just currently building a roof over the top of this to protect it. So it's not, it's got a lot of wood around it at the moment, but they're going to build a proper sort of white roof above it, so it'll be much more pristine and there'll be nothing in the way, so you can view it in its more natural state. But one of the things about this site is that it was used, they think, for about 2,000 years, and then it was deliberately reconstructed because it got damaged, and then buried under millions of tons of dirt. And really carefully buried, like it was being preserved for future generations to eventually find it, which did happen in the mid-1990s. This just shows you an artist's reconstruction and the potential alignment with Sirius, although this has obviously been negated by Andrew Collins, who's made Cygnus links with this as well. This just shows you the area where it is. But even here, going way back, there are some stones still in the original quarry, which are about half a mile from the site. This one here is roughly 22 to 24 feet long, depending on how you measure it. It's a huge one. It's really thick. It's much bigger than anything actually at Göbekli Tepe. It has no relief carvings. It's still in a rough state. This is Andrew Collins just sort of pointing out where it is by standing on it. It's really hard to find. You can barely, unless you know where it is, it's really hard to find it. But from eye level, you just can't see it whatsoever. So it's almost like you have to get above it to see what's going on there. It rests on a slight slope. Klaus Schmidt deduced that the technique employed must have been carried out by surrounding the outer shapes with a small ditch, which was made by picking it out of the rock with stone tools, and then kind of lifting it out and pushing it out. And then you have to transport and lift 20 to 30 ton blocks. This one's about 50 tons. So this is not bad for a pre-agricultural group of hunter-gatherers, potentially, who were living here at this time. So you can just see the magnitude of that, and then they would have taken it all the way up to the hill and placed it up there. This is a smaller one, which is just found nearby. This is the larger one we were talking about, the famous 22 to 24 feet one. But as we were walking back, we actually found another one. This one here, we found these squared off blocks with this T-shaped pillar still in the ground, suggesting it's another one that was going to be used and never was. This one's about 12 foot tall, which is some of the ones in some of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are about that height. It shows you a close-up of it. They must have used obsidian or something sharp to actually carve the stones, because you look at the intricacy of some of the carvings, it's really quite incredible. Shows you more examples of it just from above. This is a short, just a little video I'm just going to show of just moving around so you can have a proper look at it. So you can see these square shaped blocks all around here. Then we have the main pillar just here. There's the main top, very large top part of it, very similar to the vulture pillar. Then going down there, we obviously have the main length of it. Fascinating that this may just well be another pillar here. One of the other things I found, which is kind of intrigued me, just while I was researching this and I was looking at the geodesy and the connections between sites worldwide, is that between Göbekli Tepe and the Coricancha, which is the center of the ancient Inca or pre-Incan world in Peru, not too far from Ollantaytambo, is the distance, the surface distance between that is 7928 miles, which is, you know, roughly the Earth's diameter, which has kind of fascinated me to say. It made me really question, you know, what else is going on here. And I've done another lecture previously at other conferences as well, looking at the comparisons, and I've done an article on Graham Hancock's website you can take a look at as well, comparing Göbekli Tepe with the ancient sites in Peru and Bolivia, because there are remarkable similarities, and it potentially, if you know my hypothesis is correct, it would push the dates back in Peru and Bolivia several thousand years to a much earlier epoch. And so I think there's something going on there. You also have the tradition of the navel or the belly hill. The name of the Coricancha means the center or the navel. The name of Göbekli Tepe means the navel or the belly hill. And so you have to kind of question this tradition stretching around different parts of the world. Yeah, obviously we do our own trips there, so please join us in September if you can. Andrew and myself are taking, just for a few days, we're going over there and looking at various sites, including Göbekli Tepe and KARAHAN Tepe, which is an absolutely wonderful site. It's a very strange place. This is, KARAHAN Tepe is like the sister site to Göbekli Tepe. It's not been excavated whatsoever. All they've done is done a ground survey, collecting various discoveries on the surface and surveyed it. It's got some very interesting comparisons with Göbekli Tepe. It consists of T-shaped pillars. It looks like it's been deliberately buried. All you can see nowadays, I mean, this is one of the smaller T-shaped pillars, very badly weathered. And this is the top of a T-shaped pillar, still in the ground, so most of it is still under the ground, yet to be excavated, which really baffles us. And this goes back about 10,500 years, so it's a couple of thousand years younger than Göbekli Tepe, although it would have been in use towards the later phase of Göbekli Tepe, so they may have moved over to this area on the TEPE Mountains, again about 20 miles from Sanliurfa. You can just see what the area we're talking about here. Göbekli's there, KARAHAN's here. Sanliurfa is just under Göbekli Tepe, about here. Navali Churi is another site as well, which has been completely destroyed because a dam and some artificial lakes were built. But by September, the full site is going to be reconstructed in Sanliurfa Museum. And obviously we have Çatalhöyük as well, which is also contemporary with the later stages of Göbekli Tepe. KARAHAN Tepe is not a tourist site, so you can't really visit there easily. You have to kind of know where it is. We mapped it out. We eventually found it on our last trip there. When Andrew Collins went there in 2004, he was told by the local family who owned the farmland around it that if anyone visited it, the kid who showed them around would actually get a beating. Luckily, no one got a beating this time, so we were safe. And they just hang out with you, have cups of tea, and let you explore free of charge. So it's a great place. I've got another little video here. I just want to show you, just to show you some close-ups of the very interesting quarry stones that are still in situ at KARAHAN Tepe, very similar to what we find at Göbekli Tepe. Just behind me, this is the quarry stone, the huge T-shaped pillar, which is at least probably 18 feet long, found here at KARAHAN TEPE, just down the west side, about 30-degree slope from the main enclosure. It's a fascinating discovery. It's actually much more noticeable than the one at GOBEKLI TEPE, but again we have an example here of finding the largest stone in the quarry. So the largest stone is actually the one that never made it up, unless they obviously carve it down to a certain size to do all the relief carvings on it. We're not sure about that, but it's fascinating that it's here, and it just gives some idea of how they quarried, cut. But how they lifted it is obviously a whole different matter, which we'll have to get into another time. So you can really see how they've actually cut it from the bedrock as well, which kind of fascinates me as a megalithomaniac. They've actually sort of cut it. They must have put some picks between it, maybe some wooden. Might have been when they froze it. They could have frozen wood. That would have cracked the stone. Who knows? Let's take a closer look anyway. And this little marker stick gives you some idea of the length. We are estimating it at 18 to 20 feet. And you can just see the way this bit here has kind of been showing the T part of the pillar. And over there as well, it's like an irregular, it could be an irregular shaped pillar. Also down here you can see where they cut it from the bedrock and the curved bottom on it as well. Anyway, that gives you some idea of just, I wanted to sort of show you a little video of that to give you an idea of the landscape there as well. But again, it's well worth a visit, and I believe that this is could have been deliberately left there again, like we find at Aswan Quarry. This is my friend Kevin Fish. He came with us on the trip, and me and him actually just found the stone because no one could find it. This is another close-up of it here. And obviously what we also find there is not only the T-shaped pillars in the quarry, but also these cut marks, which is something we find all over Göbekli Tepe, all over KARAHAN TEPE and the ancient sites of southeast Turkey, but obviously all over Britain and various other parts of the world. This is another stone found on the opposite side of the hill at KARAHAN TEPE, which we think is another unfinished pillar. This is the same pillar here. And these are just some images from Andrew's 2004 visit, which, with similarities to Göbekli Tepe, we find like these serpent carvings here, beautifully cut blocks, as Andrew posing there, various other things, these sort of strange carvings here. But the other thing about KARAHAN TEPE is that rather than being in circular enclosures like we find at Göbekli, it actually is like all the pillars are like go up in an avenue, like almost like a serpent, sort of like a zigzag going up to the top of the hill, coming in from other parts of the hill, all into the same spot. So it's a very unusual site. And I do really like it. There's something about that place, but I think it's because it's been untouched. I'm not sure why that's there again. Maybe it's because it's linking to Peru. There's me, Brian Forrester, and Freddie Silva having a giggle at Ollantaytambo. Ollantaytambo. Any people know about this? This is it's quite a famous megalithic site on the in the Sacred Valley of ancient Peru. The dating of it is really under scrutiny because it looks super ancient. There's incredibly old lichen on it and things like this. But there's a quarry on the other side of the hill. This just shows you some of the examples of the stonework at Ollantaytambo, and even some what looks like T-shaped pillars carved out of solid granite. But it's the lazy stones that really interest me, and there's a lazy boy there with the lazy stones. And this is actually what they're called. There's a whole bunch of these between the quarry, which is a few miles away, with a 4-hour hike up the top of another mountain. So they had to bring the stones down from the mountain and then go up to another mountain top at Ollantaytambo, including crossing a river and rough swampy terrain. And this is one of the stones that didn't make it. It's almost like they were kind of levitating them from mountaintop to mountaintop, then they just lost concentration when a pretty girl walked by or something and plummeted to the ground. And so there's various of these marking the trail up to the mountaintop at the quarry. This is David Childress. He's been up there. I'm going to be going up there in June on our next trip, but you can see they've even got examples of what looks like a wheel to sort of move the stones around. And here's just some of the examples up on the mountaintop on the quarry. And again, we find the same markings here as we find in Aswan in Egypt. Here's just another old photo of some of the quarry at the top of the mountain. There's a huge area around the mountain. It's really hard to find all the stones apparently, but I'm going to go and find out when I go there in June. This is David getting ready to take off and pointing out some saw marks on one of the largest blocks up in the quarry. And he believes there's like circular sort of diamond tipped saws and blades were cutting the stones, much like what you find in Egypt. Here's just another one of the stones here. And so throughout Bolivia and Peru, you do find examples of these quarries. Many of the stones, for example, at Tiwanaku, come from the other side of Lake Titicaca, 100 or 200 miles away. So either they brought them across the lake and dragged them into place, or there's some other technology, which is probably how they moved the stones here at OLLANTAYTAMBO. We get a similar situation on Easter Island. This just shows you an artist's impression of the people's working to get the moai out of the bedrock. But this is called El Gigante and the Raraku Quarry, which is 72 feet tall. This is how tall this particular one. We'll have a look at some more photos in a moment. It weighs between 160 and 182 metric tons, the weight of two aeroplanes pretty much. But experts believe that had they finished the moai, they would have been almost impossible to put it into place. But the legend states that they walked into place on Easter Island or Rapa Nui, that they walked themselves, and they always walked around the magnetic area, which is the volcanic area, and then ended up in their final position, which is very interesting. It's also interesting this is 100 tons heavier than any other moai on Easter Island. It just shows you it in situ. You can still see the way it's still connected to the bedrock. There's also quite an interesting little story here. This is from Thor Heyerdahl in his book Aku Aku. I'll just read the quote. An old witch who lived on the Rana-Raraka area, the time when the sculptors made the great figures, they breathed life into the stone giants and made them go where they should. But one day the sculptors had eaten a big lobster, and when the witch found the empty shell and realized that none of the contents had been given to her, she was so angry that she made all the walking statues fall flat on their noses, and they were never moved since then. That's one of the legends. This just shows you another beautiful example, another angle of that particular stone that's left in the quarry. And again, we have another example of the largest stone in the whole culture there being left in situ, marking the sacred quarry, the sacred birthplace of the temple, in my opinion. I believe that's what partly it was all about. The OLMEC as well, all these OLMEC heads we find along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. All the stone comes from the Tuxtla Mountains, which is roughly, depending on which side it is, but at least 60 miles away, across mountains. It's very swampy there, and rivers, and lakes, and really rough terrain, rocky terrain as well. And yet they managed to move these multi-ton heads, blocks of stone, through these different areas. So most of the stone, they say, comes from that area. It's got a few little details here. But even actually in the quarry itself, there is an area where the indigenous people still revere it as a sacred site, and rituals and ceremonies still take place there. And there's actually an altar, one of the famous Olmec altars, similar to what we've got on the left there with the sort of the shaman emerging from the rock. There's actually examples of that still being used today, the ones that never got finished or deliberately, I believe, left there. So there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. This is the area of the Tuxtla Mountains all around here. This is one area where the stone comes from. This is La Venta, one of the main sites. San Lorenzo, many other sites nearby. These three are the main sites: Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, and La Venta. And this is the area they all came from, the stone, that is. So we're looking at several miles for each trip. This is just a view of the Tuxtla Mountains, where one of the quarry sites is. This just shows you actually some of the actual stone they were using from that particular area. And again, it does suggest that it could have been a tradition that was passed down through generations, where they sort of still revere the sacred quarry as part of the greater complex. Let's move back to the Middle East and look at BAALBEK. This is obviously some incredibly large stones here, as you can see here, but the best ones are in the quarry, of course. Officially, it's a Roman temple, but that's under scrutiny because they're not known to have moved stones quite this size. They got to about 300 tons was the largest they moved, but these are over 1,000 tons each. Particularly large, really. But there is evidence that the Canaanites, there's legends of giants going way back. There's a whole load of information I have. I've done an article, it's in Atlantis Rising magazine, actually in the latest issue, but it's American-based. And also on ancient-origins.net, I've done an article about all these different sites, but quite a lengthy one about Baalbek. So I'm not going to go into it in full detail here. But it has links. It was said it was refortified by Israel's King Solomon. We're going to look at Solomon shortly, around 970 BC. But what's really interesting is that they found another stone there. These are the known stones in the quarry. This is the stone of the south. This weighs 1,242 tons, it's been estimated. This is a photo thanks to Brian Forrester. He recently visited there and sent me some photos. And this one's been worked. You can see they're kind of doing things here and reusing the stone, which I think is quite unusual, probably a later Roman thing they were doing. This is the stone of the pregnant woman, and you can just see the magnificence of this. This is just over 1,000 tons, this one. So how they would have moved that slightly uphill to the main temple of Jupiter is very confusing, but it's what's down here, I'll point out in a moment, is very interesting. This just shows you the location of them, how they are. They're even sort of almost aligned in the same direction, which I thought had meaning, but I couldn't find any geodesy connected with that. This is actually the trilithon, they call it, where it's three major stones in alignment now, 800 tons each, with some other 400-ton stones making up this, what I believe is a retaining wall, because it's on a sort of slope. And how they got these here is a really, really big question. There's been lots of theories put forward that it would have taken like 40,000 people, different techniques, wrapping it in wood in a cylinder and rolling it uphill. I'm not sure. But it was probably just a bunch of giants doing it, in my opinion. So that settles that one. This shows you some other examples which you don't often see at Baalbek. This is just some of the columns, some of the great walls. Now the Romans probably did do some of this. Some of these columns actually are Aswan granite. So they got these all the way up there from southern Egypt. This just shows you some of the larger blocks making up the foundation walls. These are the 400 tonners, I think. Beautifully cut and carved, very in the style of Egypt and Peru. But last July, a new discovery was made. They decided to clean up the quarry a bit and just swept a lot of dirt out of the way. And they found a 1,650-ton block of stone, as you do. It was Janine Abdelmasih and her team of archaeologists uncovered it. And this is actually here. This is the stone of the pregnant woman here. This is one of the largest stone we saw, very large stone we saw a moment ago. And virtually underneath it, it was this one. So this is now, that previously was the largest stone in the world. Now this one is the largest stone in the world, and that's now second place. So it's very interesting that they've discovered this. How they would have moved this stone is a whole other quandary of how they could have possibly done it. It's measured at 19.6 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 5.5 meters thick. And it just really is quite magnificent. This just shows you a map of where, actually Baalbek's down here, this area, not there. But interestingly, there's a researcher called Celia Hall who I work with, and she's sort of located all the biblical giants and giant discoveries and axe heads and extremely large axe heads and things like that. And there's a lot of evidence that this whole area was the Canaanite area where giants existed. So maybe they have something to do with it. We're going to get more into that tomorrow night because it's one of the very strange stories. I mean, there's an old tradition that states that the fortress of Baalbek is one of the most ancient buildings in the world. Cain, the son of Adam, built it in the year 133 of the creation. I'm just reading this out. During a fit of raving madness, he gave it the name of his son Enoch and peopled it with giants who were punished for their iniquities by the flood. So there's legends that go way back relating giants to these sites. And it does actually link with the area of the Giza Plateau as well. There is some geodesy there of like a 3-4-5 triangle. But also, Patricia Awian, think that's his surname, sent me these photos, and these just show you some caves around the back of BAALBEK. So there's some evidence here of some other stonework where they were quarrying, and you can go inside these caves. These are like secret little ritual temples, and I believe perhaps BAALBEK was the same principle, had the same principles, the same traditions as many of these other sites we've been looking at in this lecture, that they deliberately left these extremely large stones in the quarries for future generations to go, God, how did they do that? But partly, I think, because it was actually marking the birthplace of the temple, which was a very large temple there at BAALBEK, indeed. And so I think there's something in that, which I kind of, I've been looking into quite thoroughly. But also we have, you know, there's always links with Solomon and BAALBEK and other places, and Solomon's temple. This is it. This is an interesting place. This is it's around Jerusalem area. This is like a bunch of caves under the ground there, where a lot of the stones that built Jerusalem actually came from. But Freemasons and even possibly Templars were associated with this place, which kind of intrigued me, because rituals potentially still take place there. This just shows you some other examples here. And there's evidence of people being in there for thousands of years, of rituals taking place there. And then more recently, Freemasons do some of their actual initiations there as well, which is intriguing nonetheless. And I believe the Freemasons are one of the only groups of people who actually maintained the megalithic knowledge, the techniques, and the ways that they could move, quarry and cut these stones to such perfection that we still marvel at today. It just shows you the cave entrance. Actually, this particular area was in 1868. This is a place where the first recorded Masonic ceremony took place in Palestine. And it's actually on May the 13th of that year, 1868. An initiative came from M.W. Bro Robert Morris, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Kentucky, who believed this was being used for a very, very long time. But also, we have this. This is the Western Wall, the base of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which we have. This is roughly, I think, 570 tons. This is very similar style to BAALBEK. It has precision engineering and carvings. Probably came from the quarry we were just looking at. And it's part of the Western Wailing Wall, the very base, underground part of it. This just shows you another angle on it. It just shows you here. I'm just very intrigued by the sort of beautiful precision, almost like relief carvings here of these blocks. And you have all these niches in them, probably where the candles were. But how on earth were they doing this, going back into prehistory? It really is not really been answered. And this was in 1889. T. Fisher Unwin quoted, "The massiveness of the work is on par with the Egyptian pyramid kings, and the perfection of the cutting and fitting of the stones is nearly equal." So even back in 1889, these were being revered as such. And then we have some of the measurements. They're using very specific measurements, using inches between the blocks and indents and various things. So they had a very sophisticated technology there. And recently I just came across this. It's actually a TV program I saw about, I think it was on Discovery Channel or History, and actually the guy who goes underground, there's all these underground caverns and caves all around the world. And the only place I could find information about this was on that video. I found it really hard to find anything else. But St. Petersburg Quarry in Belgium is an incredible place, and I really do want to visit here. It's about 300 kilometers long, underground. Most of it has been carved out. The Templars were involved in this place up to around 1470 AD. And it's believed that most of the churches and cathedrals in that part of the world had stone coming from this quarry. But it's a known ritual center used by the Templars and later the Freemasons. So it's almost like they had some magical kind of technique to either cut the stone, move the stone. There's markings throughout this quarry, as you can see here. These aren't the best, these are just captured from the video. But they show really intricate carving techniques and massive amounts of stone. Thousands and thousands of tons were being moved here. And then out of the quarry, lifted, and very large blocks were being used throughout Belgium and various other places. recently they found a whole bunch of these carvings and paintings on the wall, which do suggest, you can't really see it very clearly, it's the only ones I could get from the video, that do suggest that they were kind of showing some of their ritual techniques, which included quite strange things I probably won't go into here, but kind of some of the things that Peter might have mentioned in his talk, but very dark rituals that probably are now still being used in various parts of the world, which could have been used to sort of instigate magical powers of moving these stones. So, so you just had this quick survey around the world. I just wanted to sort of keep this fairly short so we can keep on time today, which we're kind of doing okay. So really, I just want to summarize what I've found through my research here, is that I really believe that there's something about the birthplace of the temple. I think it's not only is it to do with geodesy, it's to do with the placement of the later site was marked according to where the stone actually came from. But I believe the ritual technique and the actual magical technique they had of cutting and carving and the secret ways they moved these stones is still there to be found out. It's just a case of trying to work out how on earth they did it. And so, you know, we must, you know, revere these ancient peoples. And I think, you know, maybe we have to join the Freemasons to find out exactly how they did it. Yes. There is actually a group in Glastonbury, I hear, so I wonder if they'll let me in. But anyway, so I'm just going to close up with that. So I just wanted to thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be around in the breaks, and we'll be back here in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.